The amber light of kerosene lamps cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards of Murphy's saloon as Samuel Morrison sat hunched over his whiskey, the glass trembling slightly in hands marked by decades of frontier violence. At 65, his once powerful frame had settled into the careful posture of a man whose body carried the memory of every wound, every narrow escape, every moment when death had brushed close enough to leave its mark. His gray beard, streaked with white like winter frost, framed a face that looked as if it had been carved from old leather and left to weather in the desert sun. The saloon buzzed with the usual evening crowd of cowhands and drifters, their voices mixing with the tinny notes of an out-of-tune piano. Morrison traced the rim of his glass with a scarred finger, his pale blue eyes distant as he spoke to the few patrons still willing to listen to his stories. Most had heard them before, or claimed they had, and the enthusiasm for his tales had worn thin like an old saddle blanket. The long scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline caught the lamplight as he turned his head, watching the saloon doors with the practiced awareness of a man who had learned that danger could walk through any entrance at any moment. His voice, roughened by years of shouting orders over gunfire and wind, carried just far enough to reach the bartender and a young cowhand who nursed a beer at the bar. Morrison lifted his sleeve, revealing a puckered mark on his forearm where an Apache arrow had found its mark 20 years past. He was telling them about the raid on Willow Creek, how he had guided a cavalry patrol through 3 days of hell with that arrow wound festering, when the saloon doors swung open with enough force to rattle the hinges. 5 men strode in like they owned not just the saloon, but the whole territory. Their leader, a man of maybe 30 with the kind of cruel smile that came easy to those who had never faced real consequence, wore his gun low and tied down like he meant business. His name was Cole Brennan, and he had the look of someone who measured his worth by the fear he could put in other men's eyes. Behind him came his boys, lean, hungry men with the restless energy of wolves looking for something to tear apart. Brennan's gaze swept the room and settled on Morrison with the dismissive glance reserved for broken-down has-beens and drunks. The old scout continued his story, describing how he had pulled that arrow free with his own teeth, but Brennan's loud voice cut through the narrative like a blade. "So what we got here, boys?" Brennan said, his voice carrying the mock concern of a man enjoying himself. "Looks like we got ourselves a genuine frontier legend. Tell me, old timer, that scar come from shaving with a dull razor?" The saloon grew quiet except for the nervous shuffling of feet and the clink of glass on wood. Morrison's pale eyes shifted to meet Brennan's dark ones, and for just a moment, something cold and dangerous flickered in their depths before settling back into the weary resignation of age. The young cowhand at the bar shifted uncomfortably, and Morrison noticed how the boy's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before common sense took hold. Smart boy, Morrison thought. This was not the time for heroes. From behind the bar, a young woman emerged carrying a tray of drinks, her auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun that framed a face too kind for a place like this. Her name was Ruth, and she had been working at Murphy's for 6 months, saving every penny to buy passage east where she hoped to find something better than serving whiskey to men who looked at her like she was part of what they could purchase. She moved carefully around Brennan's crew, her green eyes fixed on the floor, trying to become invisible. Brennan reached out and grabbed Morrison's wrist, his fingers pressing against the arrow scar with deliberate pressure. The old scout's jaw tightened, but he made no move to pull away as Brennan traced the mark with theatrical fascination. "This little scratch here," Brennan said, his voice loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Bet you got this falling off your horse. Or maybe walking into a door. What you think, boys? Think our hero here is telling us tall tales?" His men laughed on cue, the sound harsh and ugly in the sudden quiet of the saloon. Morrison's free hand remained steady on his whiskey glass, but those who knew how to read such things might have noticed how his shoulders had begun to straighten, how his breathing had shifted from the shallow gasps of an old man to something deeper and more controlled. "The scar collector," Brennan continued, releasing Morrison's wrist with a shove that nearly spilled the whiskey. "That is what we should call you, old man. The scar collector and his fairy tales." Brennan stepped closer to Morrison's table, his boots clicking against the floorboards with the deliberate rhythm of a man who knew every eye in the room was watching him. The other patrons had gone silent, their conversations dying like embers in cold ash as they sensed the dangerous shift in the saloon's atmosphere. Even the piano player had stopped mid-song, his fingers frozen above the yellowed keys. "Come on then, Scar Collector," Brennan said, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that men use when they know their victim cannot fight back. "Show us another one of your war wounds. Prove to us you are not just some broken-down drunk making up stories to get free drinks." Morrison's pale eyes remained fixed on his whiskey glass, but his weathered hands had grown perfectly still. The trembling that had marked him as old and infirm had vanished, replaced by the kind of control that came from decades of knowing that the wrong movement at the wrong moment could mean death. Brennan reached across the table and grabbed the collar of Morrison's worn shirt, yanking it down to expose the old scout's shoulder. There, just below the collarbone, was a puckered circle of scar tissue the size of a silver dollar, the kind of mark that only a bullet could leave. The skin around it was discolored and rough, telling the story of a wound that had taken months to heal and had nearly killed the man who bore it. Well, Brennan said, his finger tracing the scar with mock tenderness. "Look at this beauty. Bet you got this in some great battle against the savage Indians, right, old man? Or maybe it was a farming accident. Maybe you shot yourself cleaning your rifle like some tenderfoot who never held a gun before." His gang laughed again, the sound echoing off the low ceiling like the cackle of carrion birds. One of them, a thin man with pale eyes and a knife scar across his knuckles, leaned forward with interest. "Tell us the story, Grandpa," he said. "Tell us how you got that there bullet hole. Make it good and bloody so we believe you." Morrison slowly raised his eyes to meet Brennan's gaze, and for just an instant, something flickered in those pale blue depths that made the younger man's smile falter. But the moment passed so quickly that Brennan convinced himself he had imagined it, and his cruel grin returned with renewed confidence. The old scout's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the silent saloon. "Bull Run Mountain," he said. "Winter of '68. Cheyenne War Party had taken 3 settlers from a homestead near the Washita. I was guiding a cavalry patrol when they caught us in an ambush." Brennan rolled his eyes theatrically for his audience. "Oh, here we go," he said. "Another thrilling tale of frontier heroism. Tell me, Ultimer, how many Indians did you kill single-handed? 100? 1,000? Morrison continued as if Brennan had not spoken, his voice steady and distant, as if he were seeing the events play out before him again. "The bullet took me high in the shoulder and spun me off my horse. Blood was freezing to my shirt before I hit the ground. But I managed to put 2 rounds into the brave who shot me before his war cry died in his throat." Ruth had been moving carefully around the edge of the room, trying to deliver drinks to the few customers who still dared to remain seated, but she paused near Morrison's table when she heard the quiet conviction in his voice. There was something about the way he told the story, something that spoke of truth rather than the boastful fabrications that drifters usually spun to impress listeners. "That is enough of your lies, old man," Brennan said, his patience with the game beginning to wear thin. He wanted fear, wanted submission, and Morrison's calm recitation was not giving him the satisfaction he craved. "You are nothing but a broken-down drunk living in the past, making up stories about glory that never happened." Ruth stepped forward, her tray clutched against her chest like a shield. "Maybe you should leave him alone," she said, her voice smaller than she intended, but carrying more courage than most men in the room could manage. "He is not bothering anyone. He is just telling stories." Brennan's head snapped toward her with the predatory focus of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. Well, he said, his tone shifting to something uglier and more dangerous. "Looks like the serving girl wants to play hero. Maybe she thinks the old fool here is some kind of knight in rusty armor." One of Brennan's men, a heavy-set brute with missing teeth and arms thick as fence posts, stepped behind Ruth and gave her a hard shove that sent her stumbling into an empty table. Her tray clattered to the floor, spilling glasses and whiskey across the scarred wood as she caught herself against a chair to keep from falling completely. The sound of breaking glass seemed to echo longer than it should have in the sudden silence that followed. Morrison's head came up slowly, and this time there was no mistaking the change that had come over his features. The weary resignation was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp as winter steel. "I would stop right there if I were you, son," Morrison said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. The words were soft, almost conversational, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty behind them. Brennan stared at him for a moment, then threw back his head and laughed with genuine delight. "Listen to that. Boys," he said. "The old goat thinks he is giving me orders. What are you going to do about it, Grandpa? Bore me to death with more of your tall tales. Before you find out what happens next, if you are enjoying this story of an old-timer who deserves more respect than he is getting, hit that like button. And if you are not subscribed yet, make sure to join us for more tales of frontier justice. Comment what country you are listening from. I love seeing how these stories of the American West travel around the world. Now, stay with me, because what comes next will show you why you should never underestimate a man based on his age alone." His gang erupted in fresh laughter, slapping their knees and elbowing each other as if Morrison had told the funniest joke they had ever heard. The sound filled the saloon with ugly mirth that made decent folks look away in shame. Brennan reached over and knocked Morrison's worn hat from his head, sending it spinning across the floor to land near the spittoon. "Look at him," Brennan said, his voice full of theatrical pity. "The ancient fool thinks he is still dangerous. Probably thinks he is still the same man who fought all those imaginary battles and killed all those make-believe Indians." Morrison slowly pushed back his chair and began to rise, his movements careful and deliberate as if his joints pained him. But there was something different about the way he moved now, something that suggested the frailty was more habit than necessity. Brennan, still riding high on his own cruelty, did not notice the change. "You know what I think, old man," Brennan said, stepping close enough that Morrison could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruelty that lived behind his dark eyes. "I think you are a coward who ran from every fight he ever faced and made up stories to cover his shame." That was when Brennan made his mistake. Still grinning with malicious satisfaction, he drew back his hand and delivered a sharp backhand across Morrison's weathered cheek, the sound of flesh meeting flesh sharp as a gunshot in the quiet saloon. The blow was hard enough to snap the old scout's head to the side and send him stumbling backward into his chair, which toppled over with a crash that seemed to shake the entire building. For a long moment, Morrison lay on the floor beside his overturned chair, one hand pressed to his reddening cheek, while his hat lay forgotten near the wall. Brennan stood over him, breathing hard with excitement and satisfaction, his knuckles still stinging from the impact. Then Morrison began to rise. He moved differently now, the careful shuffle of age replaced by something fluid and purposeful. As he straightened to his full height, the saloon seemed to grow smaller around him, and the shadows cast by the lamplight appeared to deepen and shift. When he turned to face Brennan, his pale blue eyes had changed, becoming something cold and distant as a winter sky. And for the first time since entering Murphy's saloon, Cole Brennan felt the first whisper of genuine fear. Behind the scarred oak bar, Murphy himself had been watching the confrontation unfold with the sick fascination of a man witnessing a stagecoach wreck. At 72, Seamus Murphy had seen enough frontier violence to recognize the signs when they appeared, and what he saw in Samuel Morrison's transformed posture made his weathered hands freeze around the whiskey bottle he had been polishing. The old bartender's face drained of color as Morrison straightened to his full height, the careful stoop of age melting away to reveal a man who stood 6 feet tall, with the balanced stance of someone who had spent decades expecting trouble from every direction. Murphy's pale Irish eyes widened as recognition dawned, and his voice came out as barely more than a whispered prayer. "Sweet Mother Mary," Murphy breathed to the young cowhand still nursing his beer at the bar. "That there is Samuel Morrison, Ghost Walker Morrison." The cowhand, whose name was Jimmy Dalton and who had never been more than 50 miles from his father's ranch, looked confused by the bartender's sudden reverence. "Who is supposed to be Murphy?" he whispered back, his eyes never leaving the deadly tableau unfolding in the center of the saloon. But one of Brennan's men, a weasel-faced gunslinger called Pike, had heard Murphy's whispered words and let out a harsh bark of laughter that cut through the tension like a rusty blade. "Ghost Walker," Pike repeated, slapping his knee with exaggerated mirth. "Boys, looks like we got ourselves a genuine frontier legend here. Tell me, old-timer, how many ghosts you walked with lately?" Murphy's hands were shaking now as he set down his bottle and leaned across the bar toward young Dalton, his voice urgent and low. "You do not understand, boy. That man there guided cavalry patrols through Comanche territory when the territory was nothing but blood and fire. He survived the Washita River massacre when Red Cloud wiped out 2 companies of cavalry. They called him Ghost Walker because he could move through hostile country without leaving so much as a bent blade of grass to mark his passing." Brennan had been enjoying Pike's mockery, but something in Morrison's absolute stillness was beginning to eat at the edge of his confidence like acid on metal. The old scout stood with his arms at his sides, his breathing slow and controlled, and those pale blue eyes had acquired a quality that reminded Brennan unpleasantly of looking down the barrel of a loaded gun. "Tell them about Custer," Murphy continued, his voice gaining strength as the memories came flooding back. "Tell them how Morrison rode with the 7th Cavalry before they rode to their doom at Little Bighorn. Tell them how he tried to warn Custer about the size of the Indian force they were facing, and how Custer called him a coward for suggesting they wait for reinforcements." The saloon had grown so quiet that the sound of Morrison's boots against the floorboards seemed to echo like gunshots as he took a single step forward. His voice, when it finally came, had dropped to a tone so cold and flat that it seemed to leach the warmth from the air itself. 43 scars, Morrison said, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Each one earned in blood. Each one paid for with the life of a man who thought he could kill me. Brennan felt his throat go dry, but his pride would not let him back down in front of his men and the watching crowd. "You are bluffing, old man," he said, though his voice lacked the confident mockery it had carried just moments before. "Prove it. Show us these famous scars, and tell us how a broken-down drunk like you could have killed anyone." Morrison reached up with deliberate slowness and began rolling up his left sleeve, revealing an arm that bore the roadmap of a lifetime spent in violence. The arrow scar Brennan had mocked earlier was there, but it was only one mark among many. A long white line ran from his wrist to his elbow where a Cheyenne war lance had laid his arm open to the bone. 3 small round scars near his shoulder told the story of buckshot that had failed to bring him down. "This one," Morrison said, pointing to a jagged mark near his wrist, came from a Cheyenne war lance at Sand Creek in '67. The brave who carried it thought he could pin me to the ground with it. I took it away from him and used it to send him to his ancestors." Murphy was nodding vigorously from behind the bar, his memories of old stories and whispered legends confirming every word. "I heard tell of that fight," he said, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for speaking of the dead. 20 Cheyenne warriors tried to take a supply wagon, and Morrison held them off single-handed until the cavalry patrol could reach him. Pike's laughter had died completely now, and even Brennan's other men were beginning to shift uncomfortably as they recognized that this was not the rambling fabrication of a drunk old man, but the measured recitation of a professional killer recounting his work. There was something in Morrison's tone, a matter-of-fact certainty that spoke of truth rather than boastful lies. Morrison continued his catalog of violence with the same flat delivery, rolling up his other sleeve to reveal fresh evidence of his claims. "This burn mark here came from a Comanche fire arrow that went through my shirt and stuck in a tree behind me. I pulled it out while it was still burning and used it to set fire to their war chief's lodge. Young Dalton had gone white as bleached bone and was gripping his beer mug so tightly that his knuckles showed white through his skin. He had grown up on stories of the Indian Wars, tales of legendary scouts and cavalry heroes, but he had never imagined he would find himself in the same room as one of those mythical figures. The recognition was spreading through the saloon like ripples in a pond, as men who had heard fragments of stories over the years began to piece together the legends standing before them. A grizzled prospector near the back wall was staring at Morrison with the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences, and even the working girls who had emerged from the back rooms to watch the confrontation were whispering among themselves with something approaching reverence. But Brennan was not ready to surrender his dominance so easily, even as doubt gnawed at his confidence like a persistent toothache. His pride had carried him too far to retreat now, and the watching crowd made backing down impossible without losing the reputation that was his most valuable possession. "You talk a good fight, old man," Brennan said, his voice carrying a desperate edge that everyone in the room could hear. "But talking is all you got left. You are just another washed-up has-been living in the past, and making up stories to make yourself feel important. Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Brennan with the intensity of a hawk studying prey, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had faced death so many times that it held no mystery for him. 57 confirmed kills, Morrison said, each word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. All righteous. All necessary. All men who thought they could take something that was not theirs or hurt someone who could not protect themselves. The old scout's gaze never wavered from Brennan's face as he delivered his final words, and in that moment, Cole Brennan finally understood that he had made the worst mistake of his life. Morrison stepped closer to Brennan, moving with the fluid grace of a predator that had suddenly stopped pretending to be prey. The transformation was so complete that several patrons near the back of the saloon began edging toward the door, their survival instincts screaming warnings that their conscious minds were only beginning to understand. The old scout began unbuttoning his worn shirt with the same methodical precision he had used to catalog his visible scars. This one here, Morrison said, pulling his shirt open to reveal a long, puckered line that ran diagonally across his chest from his left shoulder to just above his heart. This came from a cavalry saber at Little Bighorn, 3 days before Custer rode to his death. A lieutenant named Bradley thought I was lying about the size of the Indian force we were facing. He called me a coward and challenged me to single combat to prove my courage. Brennan's mouth had gone dry as desert sand, but his pride still would not let him retreat. That is impossible, old man, he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence and carried the desperate edge of a man trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Little Bighorn was more than 20 years ago. You would have been just a boy. Morrison's pale eyes never left Brennan's face as he continued his methodical revelation. I was 22 years old and had already spent 4 years guiding cavalry patrols through Sioux territory. Lieutenant Bradley was a West Point graduate who thought book learning was more valuable than experience. After I put him on his back, Colonel Custer decided maybe my warnings about Sitting Bull's forces were worth considering after all. Murphy was nodding vigorously from behind the bar, his memory stirred by stories he had heard whispered in saloons across the frontier. That would be Lieutenant Charles Bradley of the 7th Cavalry, Murphy said, his voice carrying the reverence of a man reciting scripture. Found dead 3 days before the massacre with a sword wound across his chest. The official report said he died in a skirmish with hostiles, but the old-timers always said it was something else entirely. Young Dalton had set his beard down completely now, his hands shaking as the magnitude of what he was witnessing became clear. He had grown up hearing campfire stories about Ghost Walker Morrison, tales that had seemed too fantastical to be true. Now he was watching the legend himself stand in Murphy's saloon, methodically proving his identity with scars that told the story of a lifetime spent dancing with death. Morrison pulled his shirt completely open, revealing a torso that bore the evidence of dozens of violent encounters. A cluster of small round scars near his ribs showed where Apache arrows had found their mark during a running battle through Devil's Canyon. A long white line across his stomach told the story of a Comanche war lance that had missed his vitals by less than an inch. But it was the scar just below his heart that made even Pike go silent with something approaching awe. The mark was perfectly round and smooth, the kind of scar left by a bullet that had been dug out by hand without the benefit of a doctor or proper tools. The skin around it was discolored and rough, suggesting an infection that had nearly killed the man who bore it. This one here, Morrison said, touching the scar with one finger, came from Chief Red Horse himself during the Battle of Adobe Walls. His war lance opened me up from ribs to backbone, but I managed to get my hands on his throat before he could twist the blade. Took his scalp after I sent him to meet his ancestors, and kept it for 3 years before I gave it to his son as a gesture of respect. The silence in the saloon had become so complete that the sound of Morrison's breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Even the working girls had stopped their whispered conversations, and the piano player sat frozen at his bench as if he had been turned to stone by the old scout's words. Morrison began rolling up his left sleeve again, this time revealing scars that had been hidden by the fabric. His forearm bore the distinctive parallel marks left by a grizzly bear's claws, for deep furrows that had healed white and smooth, but still carried the memory of that desperate encounter in the Colorado mountains. Winter of 71, Morrison said, his voice carrying the same flat delivery that marked a professional recounting facts rather than boasting. Tracked a rogue grizzly for 6 days through snow so deep it came up to my horse's belly. When I finally cornered the beast, my rifle misfired, and I had to kill it with nothing but a skinning knife and the grace of God. Those claw marks remind me that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is assume your enemy is beaten. Brennan's face had gone pale as winter frost, and his earlier confidence had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. His gang members were looking at him expectantly, waiting for him to reassert his dominance, but the words seemed to have died in his throat as the reality of Morrison's identity sank into his consciousness like poison into a wound. Pike shifted nervously from foot to foot, his hand hovering near his gun, but not quite daring to complete the draw. "Boss," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should think about this. Maybe we should just walk away and find our entertainment somewhere else." But Brennan's pride was a living thing that fed on the fear and submission of others, and it would not allow him to retreat in front of the watching crowd without a fight. His reputation was built on his willingness to crush anyone who stood against him, and backing down from one old man would destroy everything he had worked to build. "You are lying," Brennan said, his voice carrying the desperate conviction of a man trying to will reality to conform to his desires. "You are just another broken-down drunk making up stories to impress people. There is no way you could have done all the things you claim." Morrison's response was to reach behind his back with a motion so smooth and practiced that it seemed almost casual. When his hand came back into view, it held a knife unlike anything the men in the saloon had ever seen. The blade was nearly 8 inches long and forged from steel so fine it seemed to drink the lamplight rather than reflect it. The handle was wrapped in leather that had been darkened by years of use and marked with notches that told their own grim story. "This blade," Morrison said, holding the knife so that the light caught the razor-sharp edge, was made from steel taken from a Comanche war lance after the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. "I forged it myself using techniques learned from a Kiowa medicine man who owed me his life. It has tasted the blood of 23 men, all of whom thought they were faster or stronger or smarter than an old scout who should have died years ago." The knife seemed to have a life of its own in Morrison's hand, spinning and shifting with a fluidity that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. He moved it through a series of complex patterns, the blade describing geometric shapes in the air with such precision that it seemed to leave faint trails of silver light in its wake. Brennan's hand had moved instinctively toward his gun, but now he hesitated as he realized that Morrison had positioned himself perfectly to respond to any aggressive move. The old scout stood balanced on the balls of his feet, his weight distributed in a way that would allow him to move in any direction with lightning speed. His pale eyes had acquired a quality that reminded Brennan unpleasantly of a rattlesnake coiled to strike. The transformation was so complete that it seemed impossible this was the same broken-down old man who had been sitting quietly at his table just minutes before. Morrison's shoulders had straightened, his stance had shifted to something predatory and alert, and the air around him seemed to vibrate with barely contained violence. Murphy had come out from behind the bar now, moving with the careful steps of a man approaching something sacred and dangerous. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the formal respect usually reserved for speaking to clergy or royalty. "It is an honor to have you in my establishment, sir. The drinks are on the house for as long as you care to stay." Morrison's gaze never wavered from Brennan's face as he responded to the bartender's offer. "Much obliged, Murphy," he said, "but I suspect my stay here is about to be cut short. It seems these young men have some business they need to settle, and I have never been one to walk away from a conversation that needs finishing." Young Dalton had pressed himself against the bar as if trying to become one with the furniture, his eyes wide as saucers as he watched the legendary scout prepare for what appeared to be an inevitable confrontation. He had heard stories about Ghost Walker Morrison his entire life, but seeing the legend in person was like watching a mountain come to life or witnessing lightning take human form. Brennan's hand was trembling now as it hovered near his gun, and beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the cool air in the saloon. His gang members were looking at him with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright fear, and he could feel his authority over them slipping away like water through his fingers. The knife in Morrison's hand caught the light again as he shifted his stance, and for just a moment, Brennan could see his own death reflected in the polished steel. The old scout had become something elemental and deadly, a force of nature disguised as an aging man, and Cole Brennan finally understood that he had awakened something that should have been left sleeping. The confrontation exploded into violence with the sudden fury of a thunderstorm breaking over the desert. Brennan's nerve finally snapped under the weight of Morrison's deadly calm, and he clawed for his gun with the desperate speed of a man who knew his life depended on being faster than death itself. But Morrison had been reading the signs for the past minute, watching the subtle tells that marked a man about to make his play, and he was already moving before Brennan's hand cleared leather. The old scout's knife left his grip in a motion so fluid it seemed like magic, the blade spinning end over end through the lamplight to bury itself in Brennan's gun hand just below the wrist. The impact drove the would-be gunslinger backward into the bar with a scream that cut through the saloon like a rusty saw, his Colt clattering to the floor as blood began to flow between his fingers. Pike was drawing his own weapon when Morrison moved again, crossing the space between them in 3 quick strides that covered ground with the predatory grace of a mountain cat. The old scout caught Pike's gun arm at the wrist and twisted with a motion that incorporated 40 years of close-quarters combat experience, the sharp crack of breaking bone audible even over Pike's agonized howl. "This throw," Morrison said as he sent Pike spinning into an empty table with enough force to shatter the wooden surface. "I learned it from a Sioux warrior named Running Bear after he tried to gut me with a tomahawk during a treaty meeting that went bad. He was a good teacher, even if the lesson killed him." The heavy-set brute who had shoved Ruth earlier was charging now, his massive fists swinging like sledgehammers as he tried to use his size and strength to overwhelm the smaller man. But Morrison had faced bigger men before, including a 7-foot Comanche war chief who had nearly broken his back during a wrestling match that had lasted 3 hours under the blazing Texas sun. Morrison dropped low and swept the big man's legs with a move he had learned from watching wolves hunt elk, sending all that charging mass crashing into the piano with enough force to snap several keys and leave the instrument groaning like a wounded animal. The brute tried to rise, but Morrison was on him instantly, one scarred hand finding the pressure point below his ear that would drop him into unconsciousness. That particular technique, Morrison said as the big man collapsed like a felled tree, came courtesy of a Chinese railroad worker who saved my life during a Paiute raid near Carson City. He taught me that sometimes the smallest pressure applied in exactly the right place is worth more than all the brute force in the world. 2 of Brennan's remaining men had positioned themselves near the saloon's front entrance, trying to use the doorway as a bottleneck that would force Morrison to approach them on their terms. But the old scout had fought in enough confined spaces to know that terrain was just another weapon to be used by those smart enough to see the possibilities. Morrison grabbed a half-full whiskey bottle from an abandoned table and hurled it at the oil lamp hanging above the 2 gunmen. The lamp exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil that sent both men diving for cover, their clothes smoldering as they tried to beat out the flames that had caught on their shirts. While they were distracted by their predicament, Morrison vaulted over the bar with an agility that belied his apparent age, using Murphy's workspace as a shield while he planned his next move. The old bartender had taken refuge behind a stack of whiskey barrels, his eyes wide with the kind of awe usually reserved for witnessing acts of divine intervention. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Murphy whispered, his Irish accent thicker than usual under the stress of what he was witnessing. "The man fights like the devil himself, but with the discipline of a saint. I have never seen anything like it in all my years." Morrison could hear the 2 gunmen cursing as they tried to coordinate their approach, their boots scraping against the floor as they moved to flank his position. But he had been listening to men try to hunt him for longer than either of them had been alive, and their movements told him everything he needed to know about their experience and intentions. The old scout reached up and grabbed a bottle of Murphy's best Irish whiskey, the kind kept behind the bar for special occasions and wealthy customers. With a motion that incorporated lessons learned from Apache warriors who could put an arrow through a moving rabbit at 50 paces, he sent the bottle spinning through the air to shatter against the wall just above the head of the leftmost gunman. The distraction gave Morrison the opening he needed to vault back over the bar, and close with his opponents before they could bring their weapons to bear. His fist found the first man's solar plexus with surgical precision, driving the air from his lungs and dropping him to his knees, where a follow-up blow to the temple sent him to join his unconscious companion on the floor. The second gunman managed to get off a shot that splintered the bar rail inches from Morrison's head, but the old scout was already moving, using the saloon's tables and chairs as cover while he closed the distance between them. When he reached his target, the confrontation was over in seconds, Morrison's scarred hands finding pressure points and nerve clusters with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthless efficiency of a man who had learned his trade in places where mistakes meant death. But Brennan was still dangerous, even with Morrison's knife pinning his gun hand to the bar like a specimen on a collector's board. Pain and desperation had given him a kind of feral cunning, and he had managed to work his wounded hand free of the blade while Morrison was dealing with his men. Blood flowed freely from the wound, but he still had enough strength left to cause trouble. Ruth had been crouched behind an overturned table during the violent confrontation, her green eyes wide with terror as she watched the legendary scout dismantle Brennan's gang with the methodical efficiency of a man harvesting wheat. But now Brennan was moving toward her hiding place, his left hand reaching for the backup gun he carried in a shoulder holster while his right hand left a trail of blood on everything it touched. Morrison saw the danger an instant too late, his attention focused on securing the last of Brennan's conscious men. By the time he turned toward Ruth's position, Brennan had already reached her, his good hand tangled in her auburn hair as he dragged her to her feet with the kind of casual cruelty that marked him as a man who had never learned to value anything he could not own or control. "Let her go," Morrison said, his voice carrying a new quality that made the temperature in the saloon seem to drop by 10 degrees. The old scout stood perfectly still, his pale eyes fixed on Brennan's face with an intensity that seemed to burn through the younger man's consciousness like acid through metal. Brennan pressed the barrel of his hideout gun against Ruth's temple, his bloody fingers leaving red streaks on her pale skin as he used her body as a shield. "Now you listen to me, old man," he said, his voice shaking with pain and fear and the desperate anger of a cornered animal. "I do not care who you used to be or how many men you killed back in your glory days. Right now you are going to back off and let me walk out of here, or this pretty little thing is going to pay the price for your reputation." Morrison's response was immediate and absolute. The change that came over his features was like watching winter descend on a landscape in the space of a single heartbeat. His pale eyes went flat and cold as tombstone marble, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "That girl reminds me of my daughter," Morrison said, each word falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Her name was Sarah, and she had the same green eyes and the same kind heart that made her want to help everyone she met. The Comanches took her during a raid on our homestead in the spring of '69, when she was 17 years old and still believed the world was a place where good people were rewarded and evil ones were punished." Brennan's hand was shaking now, whether from blood loss or fear or the growing realization that he had made a mistake beyond redemption. "Shut up, old man," he said, his voice cracking like a whip in the sudden quiet. "I do not want to hear your sob stories. I just want to walk out of here with my life." But Morrison continued as if Brennan had not spoken, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that spoke of wounds that had never properly healed. "I tracked that Comanche war party for 11 days through country that would have killed most men in 3. When I finally caught up with them, I found what was left of my Sarah tied to a tree, and I learned that there are some things that cannot be forgiven or forgotten or set aside in the name of civilized behavior." The old scout took a step forward, and despite having a gun pressed to her head, Ruth felt safer than she had since Brennan's gang had walked through the door. There was something about Morrison's absolute certainty, his complete lack of fear or doubt, that made her believe everything was going to be all right. "I killed 7 Comanche warriors that night," Morrison continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, but carrying enough menace to make strong men's knees go weak. "I took their scalps and burned their village and scattered their horses to the 4 winds. But it did not bring my Sarah back, and it did not fill the hole that losing her had torn in my soul." Brennan's gun was wavering now, the barrel moving away from Ruth's temple as his wounded hand struggled to maintain its grip on both the weapon and his hostage. Blood loss was taking its toll on his strength and coordination, and the absolute calm in Morrison's voice was eating away at his resolve like water wearing down stone. So when I see a man like you putting his hands on an innocent girl who reminds me of everything I lost, Morrison said, taking another step forward, it awakens something in me that I have spent 25 years trying to keep buried. It reminds me that some men are born wolves who prey on the weak, and that wolves need to be put down before they can spread their sickness to the rest of the pack. Morrison's hand moved to his belt, where a second knife had been hidden beneath his shirt. This blade was smaller than the first, but no less deadly, its edge honed to surgical sharpness and its balance perfect for throwing at close range. Brennan saw the movement and tried to adjust his aim, but his wounded hand betrayed him at the crucial moment. The knife left Morrison's grip in a silver arc that seemed to bend the lamplight around it, the blade spinning once before finding its target in the meat of Brennan's shoulder. The impact spun the gunslinger away from Ruth and sent his weapon clattering across the floor to disappear beneath an overturned table. Brennan collapsed against the wall, both hands now pressed to wounds that painted his shirt crimson with his own blood. He stared up at Morrison with the kind of desperate fear usually reserved for men facing their own execution, his earlier arrogance replaced by the pleading terror of a coward who had finally met something he could not intimidate or buy or kill. Morrison stood over him like an avatar of frontier justice, his pale eyes reflecting no mercy or compassion for the man who had terrorized innocence and called it strength. The old scout's voice, when it came, carried the finality of a judge passing sentence on a condemned criminal. "You have a choice to make, son," Morrison said. "You can die here in this saloon, bleeding out on Murphy's floor while decent people step over your carcass to get to the bar. Or you can live with the knowledge that an old man who should have been easy prey handed you the worst beating of your miserable life and sent you crawling out of here like the yellow dog you have always been." Brennan tried to speak, but only managed a wet, gurgling sound as blood from his shoulder wound found its way into his throat. Morrison reached down and grabbed him by the shirt front, hauling him to his feet with strength that seemed impossible for a man his age. "If I ever see you again," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying more menace than any shout. "If I ever hear that you have hurt another innocent person or terrorized another town, I will track you down like the animal you are and finish what we started here tonight. Do you understand me, boy?" Brennan managed a weak nod, his eyes wide with the kind of terror that would follow him for the rest of his days. Morrison released his grip and let the broken man stumble toward the door, leaving a trail of blood on the floor as he made his unsteady way toward the exit. The saloon had fallen completely silent except for the sound of Brennan's ragged breathing and the soft crackling of the oil fire that was still burning near the entrance. Morrison stood in the center of the destruction he had wrought, surrounded by the unconscious bodies of men who had thought they were predators but had learned they were only prey. The silence that followed Brennan's retreat stretched like a held breath across Murphy's saloon, broken only by the soft moaning of unconscious men and the gentle crackling of dying flames where the oil lamp had shattered. Morrison stood in the center of the destruction, his chest rising and falling with the controlled breathing of a man who had just expended great effort but remained ready for more violence if circumstances demanded it. Slowly, as if emerging from a collective trance, the patrons who had witnessed the confrontation began to move again. But their movements were different now, marked by the careful reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces or the presence of something holy and terrible. They gave Morrison a wide berth as they began to right overturned tables and chairs, their eyes never quite meeting his, but stealing glances when they thought he was not looking. Ruth had remained frozen against the wall where Morrison's intervention had left her, her green eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and awe that made her look younger than her 22 years. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins during the struggle, framing her face in gentle waves that caught the lamplight like burnished copper. Morrison approached her slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening as he recognized the shock that held her motionless. "Miss," he said, his voice gentle in a way that seemed impossible for a man who had just dismantled 5 armed opponents with surgical precision. "Are you hurt? Did that animal harm you? Ruth shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally found it. No, she said. No, he did not hurt me. You stopped him before he could. You saved my life, Mr. Morrison. I do not know how to thank you for what you did. Morrison reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small object that gleamed silver in the lamplight. It was a piece of Apache jewelry, a protective amulet made from silver taken during the raid that had claimed his daughter's life. The metal had been worked by skilled hands into the shape of a thunderbird, its wings spread in eternal flight, and it hung from a leather cord that had been darkened by years of wear. This belonged to my Sarah, Morrison said, placing the cord gently around Ruth's neck. She wore it every day from the time she was 12 years old until the day the Comanches took her from me. It did not protect her when she needed it most, but maybe it can do better by you. Apache silver is supposed to ward off evil spirits, and after tonight, I think you might need all the protection you can get. Ruth's fingers closed around the small amulet, feeling the warmth that the metal had absorbed from Morrison's body during all the years he had carried it close to his heart. Thank you, she whispered, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks as the full magnitude of what had happened finally began to sink into her consciousness. I will treasure it always, and I will remember what you did for me tonight. Murphy had emerged from behind his barricade of whiskey barrels, his weathered face showing a mixture of gratitude and something approaching religious reverence. Mr. Morrison, he said, his Irish accent thick with emotion, you have done this establishment and this town a service that can never be repaid. Cole Brennan and his gang have been terrorizing honest folks for months, and the law seemed powerless to stop them. Morrison nodded slowly, but his pale eyes showed no satisfaction at the praise, only a deep weariness that spoke of a man who had seen too much violence and caused too much of it himself. Every scar cost a piece of my soul, Murphy, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent walking the line between justice and vengeance. Every man I killed took something from me that I can never get back. Violence is a poison that spreads through everything it touches, and even when it serves a righteous cause, it leaves marks that never fade. Young Dalton had remained pressed against the bar throughout the entire confrontation, his beer forgotten as he watched a living legend demonstrate the skills that had made him famous across the frontier. Now he approached Morrison with the careful steps of a pilgrim approaching a shrine, his hat clutched in his hands, and his eyes bright with hero worship. Mr. Morrison, Dalton said, his voice shaking with nervous excitement. Would you tell us some real stories? Not the ones you were telling before, when you were just trying to pass the time, but the real ones. The ones about how you learned to track and fight and survive in country that would kill most men in a day. Morrison studied the young cowhand for a long moment, seeing something in his earnest face that reminded him of himself at that age, full of dreams and eager to prove his worth in a world that did not suffer fools or cowards. He saw the hunger for knowledge that burned in Dalton's eyes, the desire to learn skills that could mean the difference between life and death on the unforgiving frontier. Pull up a chair, son, Morrison said, settling back into his original seat and gesturing for Dalton to join him. If you are serious about learning, then I suppose I have some teaching to do. But understand this. The things I am going to tell you are not adventures or exciting stories to impress girls at barn dances. They are lessons written in blood and carved into my flesh by men who paid for their mistakes with their lives. Over the next several hours, as the saloon gradually emptied of all but the most dedicated listeners, Morrison began to share the real knowledge he had accumulated during 4 decades of frontier survival. He spoke of reading sign in country where a bent blade of grass could mean the difference between life and death, of finding water in desert that seemed to hold nothing but stone and thorns, of moving through hostile territory without leaving tracks that could be followed by enemies who knew the land as well as their own bodies. Young Dalton hung on every word, asking questions that showed he understood the deadly serious nature of what he was learning. Other men drifted over to join the impromptu lesson, drawn by the opportunity to learn from a master of skills they had only heard about in whispered stories around campfires. Morrison spoke of patience, of the ability to remain motionless for hours while watching an enemy camp, waiting for the perfect moment to strike or the right opportunity to slip past unseen. He described the art of reading men's faces and voices, of knowing when someone was lying or planning betrayal, of recognizing the subtle signs that marked a man as dangerous even when he appeared harmless. As the weeks passed, word of Morrison's presence in the territory spread like wildfire through the network of saloons, trading posts, and ranch houses that connected the scattered communities of the frontier. Men began making pilgrimages to Murphy's saloon, not to drink or gamble or find entertainment, but to sit at the feet of a living legend and learn skills that no book could teach. Morrison found himself surrounded by young men hungry for knowledge, cowboys and prospectors, and would-be lawmen who understood that the frontier was changing but still demanded the kind of skills that had kept men alive during the bloodiest decades of westward expansion. He taught them to track game through terrain that seemed to hold no sign, to find their way by stars when clouds covered the moon, to read the subtle language of wind and weather that could spell survival or death for men caught in the open. But more than practical skills, Morrison taught them about honor, about the responsibility that came with the ability to take human life, about the weight that settled on a man's soul when he crossed that line between defender and killer. He spoke of the nightmares that followed him still, of the faces of men he had killed in righteous combat, but who haunted his sleep nonetheless. The young men who learned from him carried his teachings out into the territory, becoming scouts and guides and lawmen who approached their work with the same methodical professionalism that Morrison had demonstrated. They understood that violence was a tool to be used only when all other options had been exhausted, and that even necessary killing left scars that went deeper than any physical wound. On a warm afternoon in late summer, Morrison rode his old horse up a gentle hill that overlooked the valley where his homestead had once stood. The cabin was long gone, burned by the same Comanche raid that had claimed his daughter's life, but the small cemetery he had built remained intact. Sarah's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross that bore her name and the dates of her brief life, and beside it lay the remains of his wife Mary, who had died of fever 3 years before the raid. Morrison dismounted slowly, his joints protesting the movement in a way that reminded him of his true age. He knelt beside Sarah's grave and placed his hand on the sun-warmed earth, feeling the connection to the daughter who had been the light of his world during the brief time he had been allowed to keep her. "Every scar I bear is a step on the road that led me away from you," he said, his voice barely audible in the afternoon stillness. "Every man I killed was another mile between us, another barrier that kept me from joining you in whatever peace awaits beyond this world of violence and loss. But maybe, just maybe, the boys I have been teaching will use what they have learned to protect other daughters, other families, other innocents who deserve better than the cruelty that men like Brennan bring into the world." The old scout remained kneeling by the grave as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the campfires he had shared with his daughter during their hunting trips into the mountains. In those moments, surrounded by the vast silence of the frontier, Morrison felt something like peace settling over his troubled spirit. If you enjoyed this tale of an old scout who refused to let bullies have their way, and who found purpose in passing his hard-won wisdom to the next generation, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of frontier justice and the indomitable spirit of the American West. We bring you tales of courage and redemption every week, reminding us that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Until next time, may you find the strength to stand up for what is right, no matter what the cost. As the years passed and Morrison's own time drew to a close, the young men he had trained became legends in their own right, their names spoken with respect in towns across the territory. They carried his teachings with them wherever they went, and when they in turn became teachers, they passed on not just the practical skills of frontier survival, but the deeper lessons about honor and responsibility that Morrison had carved into their hearts with the same care he had once used to track enemies through hostile country. The Ghost Walker's legend lived on, not in the violence he had mastered, but in the wisdom he had shared, proving that sometimes the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in ensuring that those who come after you are better prepared to face the darkness that awaits in the wild places of the world. His scars had finally found their true purpose, not as markers of his own pain, but as lessons written in flesh and blood for those brave enough to learn from the price he had paid for his knowledge. Morrison himself rode into the sunset of his own story, but the light he had kindled in others continued to burn long after his own flame had flickered and gone out. A testament to the truth that the best way to defeat darkness is to kindle as many lights as possible before your own candle reaches its end.